On the morning of May 24, 2019, Jennifer Dulos followed a routine that had become familiar to her during a long and exhausting legal battle. She prepared her 5 children for school, ensured they were ready for the day ahead, and drove them from their home in New Canaan, Connecticut to their classrooms. Surveillance cameras later confirmed that after the drop-off, Jennifer returned alone to the house she was preparing to leave behind as part of an ongoing divorce. That drive was the final confirmed record of her movements. When the afternoon arrived and Jennifer did not return to collect her children, concern quickly turned into alarm. Friends who knew her well understood that she was meticulous, dependable, and deeply devoted to her role as a mother. Vanishing without explanation was not in her nature, and the silence she left behind immediately felt wrong. Jennifer Dulos had spent years navigating the unraveling of her marriage to her estranged husband, Fotis Dulos, a real estate developer with ambitious projects and a public image built on confidence and control. Their separation had been anything but quiet. Court filings detailed disputes over finances, property, and custody, while private communications revealed fear, resentment, and mistrust. Jennifer confided to close friends that she felt unsafe, though she struggled to articulate why. She was not someone prone to exaggeration, and those who listened understood that her concerns came from a place of careful observation rather than emotion. As the divorce progressed, Jennifer began documenting interactions and preserving messages, believing that clarity and records were her only protection. When police arrived at her home later that evening, they encountered a scene that raised more questions than answers. Jennifer's vehicle was parked in the driveway. Her belongings remained inside the house. Her purse had not moved, and there was no sign that she had packed or planned to leave. However, investigators noticed indications that parts of the home had been cleaned recently, with unusual attention paid to certain areas. The cleaning did not appear routine. It appeared deliberate. Officers also noted that Jennifer's phone was missing, a detail that immediately complicated efforts to trace her final communications. What the scene lacked was as important as what it contained. There was no forced entry, no obvious disturbance, and no clear explanation for her disappearance. As the search began, law enforcement initially considered all possibilities, including voluntary absence. That theory dissolved quickly under scrutiny. Jennifer had active plans for the coming days, ongoing court obligations, and constant involvement in her children's lives. Leaving without contact would have contradicted everything known about her character. Investigators expanded their focus, examining relationships, routines, and recent conflicts. Attention soon returned to the contentious divorce and to the man at its center. Fotis Dulos maintained that he had not seen Jennifer that day and claimed he had been working at one of his properties. His account appeared calm, cooperative, and carefully constructed. While police canvassed neighborhoods and reviewed security footage, another strand of the investigation quietly developed. Digital records, often overlooked in the earliest hours of a missing person case, began to attract closer attention. Investigators examined phone logs, email accounts, and computer activity linked to people in Jennifer's immediate circle. What they found did not initially resemble a confession or a direct admission of wrongdoing. Instead, it resembled preparation. There were searches, queries, and patterns that suggested forethought rather than impulse. These discoveries did not emerge all at once. They accumulated gradually, each piece adding weight to a growing suspicion that Jennifer's disappearance had not been spontaneous. As days passed, the investigation uncovered physical evidence far from Jennifer's home. Surveillance cameras in a nearby city captured footage of a vehicle connected to Fotis Dulos making multiple stops near public trash bins. When authorities recovered those bags, they found items stained and damaged in ways that pointed toward violence, even though Jennifer herself was still missing. The contrast between the clean, quiet home and the discarded materials elsewhere suggested a calculated effort to separate the act from the location most associated with her. This separation would later become a defining feature of the case, reinforcing the idea that the events of that morning were planned well in advance. For the public, the case quickly became both familiar and unsettling. It contained elements seen in other domestic disputes, but the absence of a body and the complexity of the evidence created an atmosphere of unresolved tension. Media coverage intensified, and each new detail drew renewed attention to Jennifer's life, her marriage, and the escalating conflict that preceded her disappearance. Friends described her as cautious yet hopeful, determined to secure a future for her children even as her personal life grew increasingly unstable. That determination, investigators believed, may have placed her directly in harm's way. By the end of the first week, the investigation had shifted decisively. This was no longer treated as a missing person case driven by uncertainty. It was treated as a criminal inquiry guided by evidence, patterns, and intent. At the center of that shift was a growing digital trail that suggested someone had not only anticipated Jennifer's disappearance, but had researched how to get away with it. The significance of that trail was not yet public, but within investigative circles, it was already reshaping the direction of the case. Jennifer Dulos had vanished, but the record of what led up to that moment was beginning to speak for her. As investigators moved deeper into the case, they began reconstructing the days leading up to Jennifer's disappearance with increasing precision. Court records showed that tensions between Jennifer and Fotis had escalated sharply in the weeks before May 24th. Custody evaluations were underway, financial disclosures were being challenged, and the prospect of losing control over assets and access to the children weighed heavily on the proceedings. Those familiar with the divorce described it as a battle defined not by compromise, but by endurance. Each side appeared determined to outlast the other, and the emotional strain was visible to everyone involved. While examining electronic data, detectives focused on devices connected to Fotis and individuals within his immediate orbit. This examination revealed a series of internet searches that would later become central to the case. These searches were not random curiosities or vague questions. They were specific, methodical, and disturbingly practical. Queries related to crime scenes, forensic detection, and ways evidence might be traced or eliminated appeared in the digital record. The timing of these searches, occurring in close proximity to Jennifer's disappearance, raised immediate concern. Investigators did not view them in isolation. Instead, they evaluated them alongside the physical evidence and the broader context of the marital conflict. One particular pattern stood out. The searches suggested an awareness of how crimes are investigated rather than a reaction to an unexpected event. They indicated preparation. This distinction mattered deeply. A spontaneous act often leaves behind chaos and inconsistency. Preparation leaves behind structure. The digital footprint suggested that someone had anticipated scrutiny and attempted to understand how to avoid it. While the searches themselves did not name Jennifer or explicitly describe an act, their relevance became clearer as the investigation progressed. Parallel to the digital analysis, law enforcement continued tracking movements through surveillance footage. Cameras captured Fotis Dulos driving from his home to multiple locations in Hartford on the day Jennifer vanished. The stops were brief but deliberate, involving municipal trash receptacles that were not connected to his usual routine. When police recovered the discarded bags, they found clothing, tools, and other materials that appeared to have been hastily disposed of. Some items showed signs of damage consistent with an attempt to destroy evidence. The locations of the disposal suggested an effort to scatter items rather than discard them in a single place, increasing the difficulty of recovery. As these discoveries came to light, investigators began questioning those closest to Fotis. Among them was his girlfriend, who had been involved with him during the final stages of the marriage. Her role quickly became a point of interest. Evidence indicated that she had assisted in aspects of the cleanup and disposal process. Text messages and surveillance footage placed her in proximity to key events, undermining early claims that she had little knowledge of what occurred. The investigation expanded from focusing on one individual to examining a network of cooperation and silence. Throughout this period, Jennifer remained missing. Search teams scoured wooded areas, waterways, and properties connected to the family. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of her body was found. This absence complicated the legal process but did not halt it. Prosecutors continued building a case based on circumstantial evidence, arguing that the combination of digital preparation, physical disposal, and motive painted a clear picture. They emphasized that while Jennifer's body had not been recovered, the evidence spoke to her fate with unsettling clarity. Public reaction to the case intensified as details emerged. Many were struck by how ordinary the setting had been. This was not a remote location or an unfamiliar environment. It was a quiet suburban community where daily routines were expected to continue uninterrupted. The idea that such planning could unfold behind closed doors unsettled residents and observers alike. Media coverage highlighted the contrast between outward normalcy and hidden calculation, reinforcing the perception that the crime had been carefully concealed beneath the appearance of everyday life. Legal proceedings moved forward with arrests and charges that reflected the seriousness of the allegations. Prosecutors outlined a theory of the case that centered on premeditation and control. They argued that Jennifer's independence and determination to protect her children represented a threat to a carefully maintained image and financial structure. The internet searches, they claimed, demonstrated intent rather than coincidence. Defense attorneys countered by questioning the interpretation of digital evidence and emphasizing the absence of direct proof. They framed the case as one built on inference rather than certainty. As months passed, the case became a study in modern investigation methods. It illustrated how digital behavior, often dismissed as insignificant or private, could carry enormous weight when examined in context. Investigators noted that the searches were not a single moment of curiosity, but part of a broader pattern that aligned with other actions. Each element reinforced the others. The case no longer relied on one piece of evidence, but on the convergence of many. For Jennifer's family and friends, the legal arguments offered little comfort. What mattered most was the unanswered question of where she was and what she had endured. They spoke publicly about her love for her children and her determination to create a safe future for them. Their statements reminded the public that behind the legal language and evidentiary debates was a woman whose absence left a lasting void. As the investigation pressed on, the digital trail that first drew attention continued to shape the narrative, quietly transforming suspicion into a compelling account of deliberate action. As the case advanced toward its legal conclusion, the focus increasingly shifted from speculation to accountability. Prosecutors assembled timelines that synchronized digital records, vehicle movements, surveillance footage, and witness statements into a cohesive narrative. Each element on its own might have been questioned, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. The prosecution emphasized that crimes in the modern era are rarely invisible. Even when physical traces are minimized, behavior leaves marks. Internet searches, phone usage, and location data create a silent record that often speaks louder than eyewitness testimony. Central to this argument was the idea that the planning had begun long before the day Jennifer disappeared. Investigators pointed to the consistency between the searches conducted, the actions taken, and the attempts to erase evidence afterward. They argued that this was not the response of someone overwhelmed by an unexpected event, but of someone executing a plan designed to minimize detection. The digital trail, in this context, was not circumstantial filler, but a roadmap of intent. It revealed a mindset focused on control, foresight, and evasion. As court proceedings unfolded, Jennifer's absence remained a powerful presence in the room. Photographs of her with her children were displayed, grounding the case in the reality of the life that had been interrupted. Witnesses described her routines, her caution, and her growing anxiety during the divorce. Friends recalled conversations in which she expressed fear without hysteria, explaining that she felt watched, pressured, and cornered. These testimonies reinforced the prosecution's claim that Jennifer understood the risks she faced, even if she could not fully articulate them. The defense continued to challenge the interpretation of the evidence, particularly the reliance on digital behavior. They argued that internet searches could be misread and taken out of context, and that assumptions about intent risked replacing proof. They reminded the court that no body had been recovered and that uncertainty remained. However, the prosecution countered by reframing the absence of Jennifer's body not as a weakness, but as part of the alleged plan. They suggested that concealment was a deliberate goal, consistent with the preparation documented in the digital record. Beyond the courtroom, the case prompted broader reflection on how technology intersects with crime. Investigators and legal experts discussed how digital footprints have become an unavoidable part of daily life. Actions once considered private now generate data that can be reconstructed long after the fact. In this case, that reconstruction provided insight into thought processes that would otherwise remain hidden. The searches did not describe a crime directly, but they revealed concern about how crimes are detected, investigated, and proven. That concern, prosecutors argued, was itself revealing. For Jennifer's children, the outcome of the case could not restore what was lost. They were forced to grow up with unanswered questions and public scrutiny, their private lives shaped by a tragedy they did not choose. Advocates for victims emphasized the importance of remembering Jennifer not only as a subject of investigation, but as a parent, a friend, and an individual with agency and resilience. Her efforts to document her experiences and seek legal protection were seen by many as acts of courage, even if they could not ultimately prevent harm. As time passed, the case became a reference point in discussions about domestic conflict and the warning signs that often precede escalation. Experts noted that prolonged legal battles, perceived loss of control, and fixation on outcomes can create dangerous dynamics. Jennifer's situation reflected how disputes that begin in courtrooms can, in rare but devastating cases, spill into irreversible actions. The planning evident in the digital trail underscored the need to take expressed fears seriously, even when they lack immediate evidence. The resolution of the case did not bring closure in the traditional sense. Jennifer's body was never found, and some questions remained unanswered. However, the verdict affirmed that accountability does not always depend on physical remains. It can be established through behavior, preparation, and the convergence of evidence. The digital searches that once seemed like abstract queries were recognized as part of a larger narrative of intent and execution. They transformed suspicion into substantiation. In the years since Jennifer Dulos disappeared, her case has continued to resonate. It serves as a reminder that technology records more than communication. It records curiosity, anxiety, and calculation. Those records can become witnesses when human voices are silenced. Investigators often say that people tell on themselves in small ways, leaving traces they do not consider significant at the time. In this case, those traces became the foundation of justice. Jennifer's story is ultimately one of visibility. Despite efforts to erase her presence, the record of what surrounded her life and disappearance endured. It existed in court documents, in surveillance footage, and in the quiet, searchable history of questions asked behind a screen. That history ensured that her disappearance could not be dismissed or forgotten. While her absence remains painful, the exposure of the truth behind it stands as a testament to the power of careful investigation and the enduring voice of evidence.